On the planet of Halcyon Prime, a place known across galaxies not for the grandeur of its commerce or political sway, but for its sinister underbelly, the infamous slave market thrived. It was an arena where civilizations intertwined, masked behind the veneer of intergalactic trade. This market, sprawling and dark, was a scar on the collective conscience of the galaxy. Zane Ryder blended into the chaos, his hooded cloak casting a shadow over his rugged features. The air buzzed with a cacophony of voices, reptilian vex traders with their forked tongues flicking in excitement, the skittering chitinous limbs of Darien nobles tapping auction paddles, and multi-eyed Syrians whose whispers carried far beyond their range. Each being, from the fierce warlords to decadent elites, had come for a singular purpose, to claim what they deemed theirs. Zane stood with a purpose far removed from the greed that rippled through the market. His presence, rare for a human amidst such a crowd, drew glances of suspicion. Yet, he ignored the curious eyes and tightened his grip on the concealed device in his pocket. Today, he wasn't here to add to the misery, he was here to break it. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Next up, a rare gem from the core worlds. Behold, a carry. The announcement sent a ripple through the throng, gasps and murmurs weaving through like wildfire. The carry were a people shrouded in mystery, known for their intelligence and unwavering spirit. Their isolationist nature kept them aloof from the affairs of the broader galaxy, making them a near myth to most. Zane's gaze locked onto the platform as she was led forward. Tall, with emerald skin that shimmered under harsh artificial lights, the carry woman exuded a grace that no chain could tarnish. Her hair, a cascade of midnight silk, framed eyes that burned with defiance. The metallic collar around her neck, inscribed with strange runes, was a symbol of subjugation, an affront that made Zane's jaw clench. Despite the noise, there was a moment when everything seemed to fade, and only she existed, standing resolute in the face of her fate. Zane's pulse quickened, not from desire, but from an instinctual resolve that surprised even him. The bidding began, fierce and unrelenting. The crowd's hunger for control, for power over another, was palpable. 25,000, came the voice of a Darien noble, his mandibles clattering as his insectoid eyes flared. Others quickly joined, the price climbing in sharp increments. Zane's fingers curled around the bidding device as if it were a lifeline. 30,000, he called, his voice a quiet storm that rippled through the audience. Heads turned, whispers intensified, but Zane's eyes never left the platform. The carry woman's gaze found his, an unspoken challenge, a glimmer of something that wasn't fear. Maybe curiosity. The auctioneer, scenting profit, bellowed, 35,000. Do I hear more? A pause, a heartbeat stretching into an eternity. 40,000, Zane said, louder this time, the words resonating with finality. It was his limit, a gamble that left no room for retreat. The Darien noble hesitated, his limbs twitching with frustration, before turning away with a hiss of defeat. Sold. To the human. The auctioneer's declaration rang in Zane's ears as if sealing a contract that went beyond currency. The tension broke in a collective sigh from the crowd, but Zane's heart still thudded in anticipation. As the guards led the carry woman down, her eyes found his once more. This time, they lingered, a silent dialogue that spoke of mistrust, perhaps a sliver of hope. Zane stepped forward, pulling back his hood, revealing the man behind the cloak. He offered no smile, only a whispered, "You're coming with me." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion darkening them like storm clouds. "Do I have a choice?" she asked, her voice strong despite the collar that marked her as property. Zane shook his head slightly. "For now, no. But that's going to change." Her jaw tightened, and the silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Yet she moved forward, willingly or resignedly, and Zane knew this was only the beginning, a choice that would unravel truths neither was prepared for. The air on Halcyon Prime was dense and suffocating, as if every breath Zane took drew in the residue of greed and desperation. But as he led the carry woman away from the auction platform, he felt a shift, a momentary reprieve from the weight of the market. The guards' eyes followed them, flickering with curiosity, but none dared question a man who had just spent a fortune on a slave. The act was final, sanctioned by the unspoken laws of this dark marketplace. Zane stole a glance at her as they walked. She moved with a regal defiance, head held high despite the glowing restraints that bound her wrists. Even in captivity, there was an air of command about her that refused to be diminished. They reached the dock where his ship, the Mistral, lay waiting. The ship was a testament to Zane's life, a rugged vessel, stripped of any luxury, built for function and survival. It hummed softly, the automated systems responding as they approached. The woman's eyes swept over the ship, her expression unreadable. It was impossible to tell what she thought of it. Was it salvation or simply another prison? Zane keyed in the access code, and the ramp lowered with a quiet whir. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to board first. She paused, her eyes narrowing as if measuring him. Finally, she stepped onto the ship, her posture taut with the wariness of someone who had learned that trust was a dangerous thing. Inside, the Mistral felt even more Spartan. The sleek metal walls and muted lights spoke of long voyages spent in solitude. It was a home that had never felt like one. The ship's AI, an efficient but emotionless voice, greeted them as they entered. "Welcome aboard, Captain Ryder. All systems are operational. Shall I prepare for immediate departure?" "Yes," Zane replied, glancing at the woman as she stood near the entrance, still bound. "Set a course for Allier V. We need to get off this rock." The AI confirmed with a soft chime, and the hum of the engines deepened as they readied for launch. She hadn't moved from her spot, and Zane could feel the silent tension emanating from her. He approached cautiously, keeping his hands visible. "You should sit," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "The jump to hyperspace can be rough." Her eyes met his, dark and unwavering. "You speak as if I have a choice," she replied, sarcasm threading through her voice. The restraints around her wrists glowed faintly, a cruel reminder of her lack of agency. Era's brow furrowed as she digested his words. Trust was a fragile seed, and in this moment, Zane hoped he'd planted it, even if only in the shallowest of soil. The silence stretched between them, less tense this time, more contemplative. "Allier V," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "What kind of place is it?" Zane's smile grew wistful. "A place where the stars are clear and no one asks questions. It's harsh, isolated, but it's home. And it's far from Halcyon Prime, far from people who'd put chains on someone like you." She turned her gaze to the viewport, the endless expanse of hyperspace stretching before them. Zane watched her as the fire in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of something else. "Hope, perhaps. Or the beginnings of it." "Then we'll see," Era said at last, her voice strong but not unkind. "We'll see if freedom is what you promised it to be." Zane nodded, feeling the first break in the tension between them. The journey ahead was uncertain, but at least they were no longer just strangers bound by circumstance. They were beginning to share something more, a fragile understanding that would be tested as surely as the stars would shine. The Mistral glided through hyperspace, the stars outside elongated into shimmering streaks that painted the cabin with shifting light. The silence between Zane and Era was no longer charged with distrust, but had settled into something more contemplative. The sharp edges of their initial encounter were dulled by the shared solitude of the ship. Zane leaned back in his seat, eyes drifting over the subtle indicators and gauges on the control panel. Yet, his attention remained tethered to Era, who stood near the viewport, watching the swirling cosmos. She was free now, unbound, but her posture still held a wariness that Zane couldn't ignore. He knew that physical chains were only part of the struggle. The invisible ones, the ones woven from betrayal, loss, and fear, were harder to break. Era's arms crossed over her chest, a shield against whatever memories haunted her. The silence stretched until it felt almost tangible, pressing down like the ship's artificial gravity. "I never thought I'd leave Halcyon Prime alive," Era said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was softer now, almost as if she was speaking to herself. Zane shifted, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her tone. He had spent countless days navigating the fringes of galactic civilization, surrounded by beings hardened by survival. Expressions of fragility were rare, especially from someone like Era. "What was it like?" he asked, keeping his voice low, neutral, so as not to disturb the delicate moment. Era's eyes remained on the stars, but her expression darkened, shadows playing across her emerald skin. "Like being swallowed by darkness. No matter how hard you fight, there's no escape, no light. Just the constant reminder that you are property, less than a person." She took a breath, steadying herself. "The worst part isn't the chains or the confinement. It's the silence. The days when no one speaks to you because you're not worth their words. A muscle tightened in Zane's jaw. He'd known that Halcyon Prime was brutal, a place where lives were bought and sold like cargo, but hearing it from Era stirred something visceral within him. He knew the silence she spoke of, the suffocating void left when hope was stripped away. He stood and moved to the small storage compartment by the wall, retrieving a flask of water. Offering it to Era, he waited as she eyed him with suspicion before finally accepting. She drank slowly, each sip deliberate, as if savoring the simple act of choice. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, less heavy. "When we get to Allier V," Zane said, breaking the quiet, "there's not much in terms of comfort, but it's safe. No one will come looking for you there." He paused, searching for words that didn't sound hollow. "You can start over, if that's what you want." Era turned, her gaze meeting his. There was a shift in her eyes, as if she were seeing him for the first time not as a captor or savior, but as something in between, a man who carried his own ghosts. "Why did you leave the core worlds?" she asked, the question cutting through the space between them like a blade. Zane hesitated. It was a question he had asked himself too many times. The answer was tangled in memories of battles fought, ideals shattered, and a life abandoned. "I was in the military," he said at last, voice rough with the weight of past regrets. "Back when I still believed in something bigger than myself. But the things I saw, the corruption, the way power was used to break rather than build, I couldn't be part of it anymore." Era's expression shifted, a subtle change that spoke of recognition. "War changes people," she said quietly. "It makes us question everything we thought we knew." Zane nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile devoid of humor. "It does. That's why I chose Allier V. It's far enough from everything that it almost feels like a different galaxy. A place where you can just be." For the first time, Era's posture relaxed, if only slightly. She looked away from him, back to the stars that seemed endless. "Perhaps that's what I need," she said, more to herself than to him. "A place where the past doesn't reach." The Mistral hummed around them, an ever-present backdrop to their unfolding conversation. Zane watched her as she gazed out at the starlines, and in that moment, he realized that their journey was more than just a flight from one world to another. It was an escape from who they had been, a step toward who they might become. The silence that settled between them now was different. It wasn't charged with distrust or the burden of words left unsaid. It was the silence of understanding, fragile and tentative, but real. As the hours ticked by, the anticipation of Allier V grew, not just as a destination, but as a possibility, a place where both of them might finally find the freedom they sought, on their own terms. The Mistral emerged from hyperspace with a shudder, the view outside shifting from the surreal blur of starlines to the stark, rugged beauty of Allier V. The planet sprawled below them, a tapestry of jagged mountains and endless deserts bathed in muted shades of red and gold. Zane felt the familiar tug of anticipation mixed with an unexpected twinge of uncertainty. This was his sanctuary, a place that had sheltered him in his self-imposed exile. But now, it was about to become something else entirely, shared ground. Era stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the planet through the viewport. There was no awe or fear in her eyes, just a deep, unreadable focus. The light from the ship's console cast a soft glow over her features, accentuating the quiet determination that never seemed to leave her. She caught Zane watching her and held his gaze, the silence between them weighted by unasked questions. "This is Allier V," she asked, her voice neutral, though a subtle tension pulled at the edges of her words. "It is," Zane replied, his tone softer than usual. "It's not much, but it's safe. And for now, that's what matters." Era said nothing, only nodding as the ship descended through the thin atmosphere. The landscape rushed up to meet them, rocky cliffs and dunes shifting like a mirage. The Mistral settled onto a landing pad nestled against one of the craggy outcrops, its engines winding down with a low, contented hum. Zane exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar sense of grounding as the ship came to rest. The ramp lowered with a hiss, and Zane led the way out, the dry, biting wind of Allier V greeting them like an old friend. The air was thin but clean, untouched by the industrial pallor of the core worlds. Era stepped out behind him, her posture straight and guarded. The harsh landscape seemed to suit her, rugged and resilient. "Welcome to Allier V," Zane said, turning to her with a faint smile. "It's not the core, and it's definitely not Halcyon Prime." Era's dark eyes scanned the terrain, taking in the jagged horizon and the small, sturdy structure nestled against the cliff. The homestead was simple, built for function, with solar panels and wind turbines catching the last of the daylight. It wasn't luxury, but it was a fortress against the chaos of the galaxy. "It's quiet," she said, almost as if testing the word on her tongue. "That's why I like it," Zane admitted. "No one to answer to. No noise, no politics. Just peace." Era's gaze met his, a flicker of something passing through her expression. Skepticism, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. "Peace is a luxury," she said, more to herself than to him. "One I'm not sure I know how to trust." Zane nodded, the weight of her words echoing within him. He had felt that way once, long before Alire V became his refuge. "It takes time," he said, "and sometimes it never feels real. But it's here if you want it." They stood there for a moment, two figures cast in the glow of the setting sun, each carrying unseen scars. The wind tugged at their clothes, whispering secrets only they could hear. Zane took a step toward the homestead, the metal of the landing pad creaking underfoot. He gestured for Era to follow. Inside, the space was sparse but functional. A narrow cot sat against one wall, a small table cluttered with maps and datapads in the center, and a worn, leather-bound journal lay open as if abandoned mid-thought. Era's eyes swept over the room, taking in every detail, cataloging it as she did everything else. "It's not much," Zane said, almost apologetically. "But it's home." Era walked slowly to the table, fingertips brushing the surface as if testing its reality. "Home," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned back to face him, her expression softer, though the guardedness remained. "Why did you bring me here, really?" Zane met her gaze, the question piercing in its simplicity. He hadn't thought about the why beyond the initial instinct that had driven him at the auction block. He ran a hand through his hair, the old gesture betraying his unease. "I didn't want to leave you there," he said at last. "And I guess I didn't want to be alone anymore." The admission surprised even him, and for a moment he felt exposed, as if she could see every raw nerve beneath his skin. But Era didn't react with skepticism or anger. Instead, her expression softened, and she nodded, just once. "I understand," she said quietly. The room settled into a silence that felt different from before, less like a void and more like a space waiting to be filled. The wind outside howled, a reminder of the harshness beyond these walls. But inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Zane felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost: connection. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadow, they stood in that shared silence, two souls finding their footing in unfamiliar ground. Night fell swiftly on Alire V, bringing with it a silence so deep that it seemed to settle into every corner of the homestead. The sky above stretched out like an endless canvas, splattered with constellations that glimmered cold and distant. Zane stood at the small window, arms crossed as he watched the last traces of sunlight bleed away into darkness. The air inside the homestead was warm, tinged with the scent of metal and dry earth. It was a far cry from the cold, unfeeling steel of a military barracks or the suffocating crowds of Halcyon Prime. Behind him, Era moved quietly, familiarizing herself with her new surroundings. He could hear the subtle creak of the floor as she paced, could almost feel the weight of her gaze as she studied the room. The silence between them had settled into something less brittle, as if they had reached an unspoken agreement to give each other space to navigate this new reality. Zane's eyes drifted to the journal on the table, its worn pages a collection of memories, plans, and scribbled regrets. It was one of the few personal items he allowed himself. He didn't reach for it now. Some thoughts were better left undisturbed. "You didn't ask me why I stayed," Era said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper. Zane turned, surprised that she had spoken at all. She stood by the table, one hand resting lightly on its edge, her dark eyes fixed on him. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he said, leaning back against the wall, arms still folded. The dim light from a small overhead lamp cast shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles and the tired determination that lingered there. Era's gaze didn't waver. "I stayed because I needed to understand," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "Why a man like you, someone who had every reason to look the other way, would risk everything for a stranger." Zane felt a flicker of discomfort under her scrutiny. He didn't have an answer that would make sense to her, or even to himself. I suppose I was tired of doing nothing, he admitted, the honesty surprising even him. Tired of seeing things and pretending they didn't matter. Era's expression shifted, a slight softening that spoke of shared understanding. Most would still look away, she said, almost to herself. But you didn't. Zane pushed off the wall and took a step closer. The room felt smaller now, the space between them charged with something unsaid. Maybe it's because I've been on the other side, he said. When I left the military, I thought I was done being a part of something that took more than it gave. But it turns out, walking away isn't the same as making a difference. Era's eyes dropped to the floor, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the table. The room hummed with the unspoken, both of them carrying weights that couldn't be measured. Where I come from, she began, her voice low, people are taught that trust is earned, never given. We value independence so fiercely that to rely on another is seen as weakness. But we were wrong. Zane's brow furrowed at the admission, sensing the raw edge of vulnerability in her voice. You weren't wrong, he said gently. You were just taught to survive in a world that doesn't make room for trust. She looked up at him, eyes glistening with an emotion she quickly masked. And you? What were you taught? Zane let out a breath, the question slicing through him like a blade. I was taught that loyalty was everything, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a soldier's past. But I learned that loyalty means nothing when it's to a cause that doesn't deserve it. A moment passed between them, heavy with the echoes of lives lived in the margins of trust and betrayal. Era nodded, a silent acknowledgement that their paths, though different, had been shaped by the same hands of fate. I don't know what this place will become for me, she said, breaking the stillness. But for now, it's more than I had. It's yours, Zane said, his voice firm but kind. Whatever you need it to be. The night deepened around them, the stars outside blazing cold and clear. Inside the homestead, there was warmth, not just from the flickering lantern but from the fragile threads of understanding they were beginning to weave. Trust, they both knew, was not something given lightly. But here, on this forgotten edge of the galaxy, perhaps it was something they could build, one unspoken truth at a time. As they stood there, the silence was no longer empty. It was full of the past, of questions unanswered, and of the first tentative steps toward something neither of them had expected. Dawn crept over the horizon of Allier V, casting the rugged terrain in hues of amber and shadow. The light filtered through the small window of the homestead, reaching Zane before he had even opened his eyes. The warmth of the morning sun was familiar, but today it brought with it a rare sense of anticipation. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and listening to the quiet hum of the wind turbines outside. Across the room, Era was already awake. She stood near the window, her posture relaxed but vigilant, as if she were trying to absorb every detail of this new world. The early light painted her emerald skin in gold, softening the sharp edges of her features. For a moment, she looked less like the defiant stranger he had rescued and more like someone finding their footing on unfamiliar ground. Couldn't sleep? Zane asked, breaking the silence with a voice still rough from sleep. Era glanced at him, her expression unreadable but not unkind. I've learned to sleep lightly, she said, her tone carrying the weight of past vigilance. She turned back to the view outside, the barren expanse stretching endlessly, interrupted only by the jagged peaks that framed the horizon. It's strange, she continued, almost to herself, being somewhere that isn't surrounded by metal bars or the echo of commands. Zane stood, the floor cool beneath his feet, and moved to the table where a small kettle sat. He poured water into it and placed it over the heating element. The simple act of making morning tea felt grounding, a ritual that spoke of normalcy in an otherwise unpredictable galaxy. It takes time to let that feeling go, he said, watching the steam begin to rise. The sense that you're still trapped even when you're not. Era's gaze shifted to him, her dark eyes studying his face as if searching for answers he hadn't given yet. Why do you know so much about captivity? The question was straightforward, devoid of malice, but it was piercing all the same. Zane didn't flinch. He met her eyes, recognizing the silent challenge in them. Because there was a time when I was a prisoner too, he said, his voice steady. Not in chains like yours, but in a different kind of prison. One built of orders, rules, and blind loyalty. Era's brow furrowed, curiosity breaking through her guarded expression. You mean the military? He nodded. Yes. There was a point when following orders felt like the right thing, even when it meant turning a blind eye to things that weren't right. Until one day, it didn't. The kettle hissed, breaking the momentary stillness. He turned to pour the tea, the fragrant steam curling into the air. That's why I left. To find a place where I could live without those chains. Era accepted the cup he handed her, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She didn't drink immediately, just held it, letting the silence stretch between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. I once believed that freedom was something we claimed, something we had to take by force if necessary. Now, I'm not so sure. Zane's eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. Freedom isn't just escape, he said. It's choosing who you want to be when the chains are gone. Era's expression shifted, a flicker of something unspoken passing through her eyes. She took a sip of the tea, the warmth seeming to ease the tension in her shoulders. Then perhaps I will stay, at least until I figure out who that is. A smile tugged at the corners of Zane's mouth. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. You're welcome for as long as you need, he said, setting his cup down and leaning back against the table. The light outside grew stronger, casting long shadows across the room. The silence returned, but it was comfortable now, as if they had reached an understanding that didn't need words. The wind carried the dry scent of the desert, mingling with the warmth of the tea and the subtle hum of the homestead systems. Zane watched Era as she gazed out the window, her eyes no longer searching but simply seeing. For the first time, she seemed present, not just surviving but existing in the moment. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, something that went beyond duty or compassion. Trust, he realized, was not built in grand gestures but in these moments, small and steady, each one laying the foundation for whatever would come next. And as they stood there in the soft glow of morning, Zane knew that the journey they had started, one driven by necessity and chance, was now becoming something more. Outside, the sun rose higher, bathing Alire V in its relentless light, and inside, two souls began to find their way forward, no longer alone.